Hey everybody, my name is Scott Grant. I'm here to talk to you about an event that occurred 75 years ago, April 10th, the main event of this year. It's the 52nd time this year that I've given this presentation. It's been amazingly popular, so I hope you enjoy it. Okay. On December 7th, 1941, we all know the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Fairly quickly thereafter, Hitler declares war on the United States, Churchill declares war on Japan, and we, the United States, are involved in a two-ocean war. The Germans had a plan for that eventuality, and they expected to go to war with the United States at some point. They did. And part of that plan was to send submarines to the east coast of the United States to sink our merchant ships. And some of the submarines went to the Caribbean. Some of them went to the east coast, which was called the Eastern Sea Frontier. The very first submarines leave Germany France. They leave their submarine bases in western France before Christmas of 1941. One of those vessels is commanded by a man named Reinhard Hartigan. The designation on the boat is the U-123. And they arrive off New York in early January of 1942. Hartigan pilots his sub on the surface into the outskirts of New York Harbor, and they sit there all night long with fishing vessels and other small craft moving around in their vision, and they are waiting for a ship to sink. Hartigan hopes that he will encounter an oil tanker, or at least a large merchant vessel that he can sink within sight of New York City. And he brings up some of the crew on deck, and they look at the lights of New York. When he gets back to Germany from this mission, he writes an article in the German magazine that's exceptionally popular called Wir sehen New York, We See New York, and includes pictures that they took from the deck of the U-123 of Manhattan in the distance. No vessels, no targets present themselves. So as dawn approaches, he moves east along the coast of Long Island, looking to put down for the day. That's what the Germans did. They would hide on the sandy bottom of the continental shelf during the daytime, and at night they would come up and hunt. Along the way, he encounters a ship called the Coimbra. It's a British oil tanker. He sinks her about 30 miles off the coast of Coney Island. In Coney Island and southern Long Island, houses and windows shake from the explosion. People on the beach can see the penumbra of the flames off in the distance on the horizon. In fact, one of the people who claims that they saw that was a man named Woody Allen. Having completed his mission, and this first mission takes him from New York down to Virginia. He sinks 10 merchant ships, and then he returns to his submarine base in Lorient, France, on the Atlantic coast to refit and resupply. There are never more than 7 German submarines off the east coast of the United States at any one time during the first 7 months of 1942. Usually there are about 5 of them. During that period, they sink 244 merchant vessels over a 7-month period. That's about one a day. That includes 22% of our tanker fleet. And 3,051 merchant mariners lose their lives. It's about a 1 in 10 survival rate for that period, and it's the worst survival rate of any armed services, of any of the U.S. armed services. There were worse survival rates in Russia and Germany, obviously. The video that we're watching, where you see the video, that's actual video of the U-123. What I like to call our submarine, the submarine that will come here in April of 1942 and cause a lot of damage. The movie versions that you're seeing, the grainy movie versions, are from a 1941 film called U-Boats Westward. It was made to be seen in the German theaters. A German worker, having put in a long shift at the BMW plant, making V-1 rockets, could go relax and watch this film about the valiant German submariners. As it turns out, in the movie, they use the U-123, our actual submarine. So that's not what she looked like, that's her. In some of the video, she's portrayed as the U-2613. The Germans never complete the 2613. There is no such boat. That was censorship purposes in case the film ended up in the hands of the British. The other footage, and I'm not sure for absolutely which version I have here, but there's cleaner footage, and if that's up there, it's footage of Hartigan returning from his first mission. It's Wehrmacht footage, and it includes him being received by Admiral Dönitz, who's commander of the German submarine fleet. Having refitted and resupplied, Hartigan and his crew head back to the United States, and they're headed to Florida. And like tourists for decades, they were very, very excited to be going to Florida. Not everybody in Germany got to go to Florida in those days. And they come down and they get here on April the 8th, 1942. And actually they arrive in Brunswick on that date, but that is still part of Florida. And in the course of 50 minutes, Hartigan sinks 2 oil tankers, and they're traveling in a convoy up the coast headed north. The first of the ships is the SS Oklahoma, owned by Texaco Oil Corporation. Hartigan torpedoes that vessel. He then repositions his submarine to torpedo the second vessel in line, which is the SS Esso Baton Rouge, owned by Standard Oil of New Jersey, which we now call Exxon. Having torpedoed the SS Esso Baton Rouge, he then goes back and opens up on the Oklahoma with his 10.5 centimeter deck gun. 19 men die on the Oklahoma, only 2 on the Esso Baton Rouge, and it's because the Esso Baton Rouge was never attacked with gunfire. A man in St. Simon's Island by the name of Olaf Ole Olsen takes out a Fairform 42-foot Fairform flyer built by the Huckins Boat Company of Jacksonville, Florida, not very far from where we are meeting today. People in the room know the Huckins Boat Company? It's a big name. The ship is owned by Charles Howard Candler, who's the son of the man who founded Coca-Cola. And Olsen reportedly received a message from an airplane that flew overhead, dropped a note wrapped around a rock, and it told him to go out, and he did in this Fairform flyer, and he rescues 42 survivors. And that event plays out again and again along the east coast of the United States in the first 7 or 8 months of 1942. I like to think of it as the American Dunkirk. Individuals go out and rescue these guys. Remember, 244 ships. The entire east coast is littered with ships that were sunk by Germans during this period. The German submariners called it the second happy time. Hartigan then moves south, puts himself down on the bottom. The next night, he, off St. Mary's, sinks a refrigerated banana boat owned by the United Fruit Company called the SS Esparta. And the SS Esparta is carrying a lot of bananas. In fact, so many bananas that bananas wash ashore in Jacksonville Beach for weeks afterwards. So many that on April the 19th, the Associated Press runs a national story about these bananas. And there's a clipping in my video at some point. The Department of Health urged people to wash their bananas before consuming them. There's a guy in town named Philip May who says he ate 2 of them, but they tasted sort of oily. He then proceeds further south, and he gets to the St. John's lightship, and he makes a right-hand turn. And it was really neat to see Scott's presentation before mine, because he had a picture of the lightship, that one ship that said St. John's across it. I've never seen that picture, so I was really excited to see that picture. But that's apparently what it would have looked like. That's what Hartigan saw. He was a little nervous that the lights from the lightship might give away his position, but he goes past the lightship and he goes in towards the St. John. And how close does he get? Alan Bliss and I have discussed this a lot. We think he probably came in on the north side, and that he probably, on the north side of the jetties. But in any event, he comes in close enough that he can look around inside Mayport. And he determines that there's nothing there that scares him. Mayport was brand new. At that time, they had 4 vessels. The men working at Mayport referred to the fleet, the 4 vessels, as the Porgy Patrol. And a porgy's a little bait fish, like a sardine. I don't know if they're any good to eat or not, but they do grind them up into fertilizer. And they smell awful when you grind them up. We had 1 yacht. There was a minesweeper, and there were 2 converted Coast Guard cutters, 1925 6-bitters. They were designated the YP-31 and the YP-32 when they were transferred to naval duty. But they're part of that fleet of Coast Guard cutters that was built in 1925 to stop rum runners. Rum runners. Ponte Vedra, it's hard to say. Rum runners. So to stop Joseph Kennedy from bringing booze into the United States. Having done this, he then cruises up and down Jacksonville Beach for the rest of the night. And they're amazed by the lights. They look at the Ferris wheel, the roller coaster, the cars driving up and down the beach, all the people, and they claim that they can see the people. Now, they would have had binoculars, but they claim they could see the people walking on the boardwalk. I think at this point, Hartigan hopes the target will present itself and he will have another opportunity similar to the one that passed him by in New York City. But no vessels come along. And that night, or excuse me, that day, he sets down on the bottom about 3 miles off the coast of Ponte Vedra, very near the spot where Ponce de Leon discovered Florida. And what fascinates me is that nobody knew he was there. He's 3 miles, maybe 4 or 5 miles from my house, and nobody knew he was there. The next morning, or afternoon, they raise the submarine to periscope depth, and they begin what Hartigan describes as an underwater advance on St. Augustine. He wants to be off the St. Augustine lighthouse by dusk. He wants a full night hunting. He wants to sink something. And as they advance on St. Augustine, rather than use the periscope, they follow the radio signal from WFOY, which is the first radio station in this part of the world. It was founded in 1937 by the husband and wife couple that owned the Fountain of Youth, hence the call letters, FOY, Fountain of Youth Radio. And there's a story, and Gannon relates it in his book. It's probably made up, but it's a good enough story either way. It's a story, right? It's true that it's a story. The story says that as the Germans approached St. Augustine, they were listening to the radio, and they did do that. They were fascinated by American radio, and that they knew the answer to the secret quiz question for that day. And it was essentially like Name That Tune. They would play a snippet of a popular song, and the Germans knew the answer. But they couldn't call in because they're on a submarine. Somebody else won the $11. Supposedly, the answer to the question is Boogie Woogie by the Tommy Dorsey Band. At around 6 o'clock, Hartigan surfaces a mile off the coast of St. Augustine Beach in broad daylight. Again, nobody knows he's there. He brings some of the crew up on deck to look at America as he had in New York. Some of them even joke about being able to see pretty girls on the beach. And he then begins to cruise up and down from Marineland in the south to Villano, or the Surfside Casino at Villano Beach in the north, never letting the St. Augustine Lighthouse out of view. That was his landmark. Now, Marineland would have been incredibly well lit at that point. It was the #1 tourist destination in Florida. It was then what Disney is now. Everybody went there to see the dolphin show. You know, the guy would feed the dolphins like this. You know what I'm talking about? In 1948, the Times-Union says that guy is the most photographed person in America. But one of the reasons that people liked to go there besides the dolphins was that rich and famous people hung out there, including Ernest Hemingway, who liked to drink at the Moby Dick Bar and Grill, which was operated by the husband of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, who wrote The Yearling and is the most famous author from this area. There's a story that, and I know this one's true because I've seen these notes. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, Ernest Hemingway sends a note to Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings one night at the Moby Dick Bar and Grill and says, you know, I would love to have a drink with you if you're in fact Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. To which she responds, the lady would love to have a drink with you if you are in fact Ernest Hemingway. So they're cruising up and down, they're headed north. They see what initially they think is 2 ships headed north along the coast. And they see this outlined against the lights of Volano. And they quickly determine it's not 2 ships, it's 1 ship, it's one very large ship, and it's an oil tanker. It's what they're looking for. The ship in question is the SS Gulf America. It's owned by Gulf Oil. It's on its maiden voyage from Port Arthur, Texas to New York. She's under the command of Master Oscar Anderson. She has a complement of 48, including 7 naval personnel to operate the deck gun. She's one of the first oil tankers to be outfitted with a deck gun. She's 485 feet long. She's making 12.5 knots and a zigzag course up the coast. And she's laden with 90,000 barrels of heating oil. The Germans give pursuit for 75 minutes from Volano to Jacksonville Beach. And someplace around Ponte Vedra, the Gulf America stops its zigzag course and begins to make a course due north at about 3 nautical miles off the coast. No one's sure why she stopped zigzagging, but the general presumption is that the master felt safe because he was so close to a major U.S. naval base. I mean, what German submariner in his right mind was going to try and sink an oil tanker, 5 miles from Mayport? But as we know, Hartigan knew better. As on board the Gulf America, the merchant mariners would have been probably staring out at Jack's Beach, somewhat wistfully. They would have looked at children of all ages riding the roller coaster and the Ferris wheel, soldiers and sailors walking up and down the coast, the boardwalk, in and out of the bars, the bathhouses, the bingo parlors, and the other amusements. On the pier, the Jacksonville Beach Volunteer Fire Department is having its first annual Fireman's Ball. And several hundred couples have paid $3 apiece to dance under the neon glow of the 7-Up sign on the old pier. Hartigan comes in behind. And comes in behind the Gulf America at about a 35-degree angle. We got submariners in the room? No? Sometimes I do. This is a bad angle to make a torpedo attack. It's the worst angle to make a torpedo attack. What Hartigan should do now is break off the attack, go out around the St. John's light ship boat, and maybe take the Gulf America at a 90-degree angle off of Brunswick. But he doesn't. He launches at this rakish angle at a distance of about a mile. He fires his second to last torpedo, and he begins to count the stopwatches. They expect that the torpedo will take 2.5 minutes to hit the Gulf America. 2.5 minutes go by, 3.5, approaching 4 minutes. Hartigan begins to curse himself for making this bad shot and to make the plans to go out around the St. John's Light ship. And then there's this tremendous explosion. A passing Eastern Airlines flight says that the orangish red mushroom cloud leaps 500 feet into the air. 1,500 pounds of dynamite impacting with 90,000 barrels of kerosene. It's a huge torch-like explosion. On the shore, Philip May and his friends from high school are on the merry-go-round, and they again and again and again treated to the image of the seas on fire. The radio operator on the Gulf America was a man named William J. Maloney out of Atlantic City. His first thought when the torpedo hit next to the boiler room on the starboard side must have been, "Oh no, not again." This was his second sinking in 30 days. And he would go back to sea immediately. In fact, one of his biggest complaint about the event is that from the moment he went down the rope ladders and got into the lifeboat, that he stopped being paid. The naval guys kept getting paid. They were in the Navy. The merchant mariners, once they were off that ship, that was it. They had to get on another boat to get paid. I understand Gulf Oil gave each of the men $150 for being sunk. On the shore, people don't really know what's going on at this point. It might be an accident. The idea that it's an attack by a German submarine 4 miles off the coast as they rush out to look doesn't occur to most people immediately. But what happens next makes it clear, and it's what makes this event so interesting and unusual. For whatever reason, and we'll talk about the reasons in a second, Hartigan takes his submarine, he pilots it around the stern of the Gulf America. He places his boat between the burning wreck and the shore, so that everyone on the shoreline can see the outline of his submarine as he begins to shell the Gulf America a dozen times with his 10.5-inch deck gun. And at the same time, he opens up with his machine guns trying to take out the radio antenna so that the Gulf America cannot send a distress signal. And thousands of people stood on the shore and watched in horror. 19 men are killed. When they pull William Glenn Rhodes, who's one of the naval personnel's burnt and blackened body from the ocean, the skin literally peels off his arm. He survives for 2 days in Mayport before succumbing to his injuries. His family does not find out that he survived those 2 extra days until June of 1945. When Hartigan comes here in the 90s, and he speaks all over Jacksonville in 90 and 92, he tells the story that he takes his submarine to the landward side because he's just so close to the shore that he's scared that if he fires at the Gulf of America and he misses, that he may injure innocent people on the shoreline. For that reason, the Times Union in 1990 refers to him as a humanitarian. Now, and Father, there was by the way, I heard in newspapers, there was virtually no newspaper coverage. All of this was censored. The Navy and the federal government did not want anyone to know that we were losing the battle on the eastern sea frontier the way we were. In fact, the entire Loose Lips Sink Ships campaign is part of the cover-up. But in any event, I think that Hartigan, Father Michael Gannon, who was there that day and runs out to St. Augustine Beach as a 16-year-old to look north at the flames, writes the book Operation Drumbeat, and he likes Hartigan's story. I don't think that's why Hartigan did it at all. I think Hartigan had attempted to put on a spectacular display in New York, and again the night before at Jacksonville Beach, and he now had his opportunity and he seized it. To sink an American ship within sight of the coastline was a major coup. Hitler would brag about it in the Reichstag even before Hartigan makes it back to France. And that night in his logbook, he says, "We put on quite a display for the tourists tonight. Naval gunfire, oil tankers aflame, enemy submarines, things not often seen in America." And he adds that it was all at Roosevelt's expense. There are merchant mariners in the room. And there's a guy on board that's a hero to me and many others. A man named Vasco Rudolph Gear. He's born in Jacksonville in 1885. In World War I, he serves as a lieutenant in the Navy. At this point, he's 57-year-old chief engineer on the Gulf of America. He too goes over the ropes and down and is rescued. And after the event, he goes back to sea like most of the others, and he says, this is what he says: "Our soldiers and sailors need those supplies to keep fighting the enemy, and we mean to see that they get them. Along the way, he encounters a destroyer that's been dispatched out of Miami. It's the nearest destroyer, the Dahlgren, named for the father of naval gunnery. And the Dahlgren's headed north because they're looking for the submarine that sank the 2 oil tankers 2 nights before. Hartigan's moving south, looking for more targets. They intersect. Hartigan does a crash dive in 60 feet of water, puts his submarine on the bottom. The Dahlgren passes overhead, launches 6 depth charges. The submarine shakes, the valves burst, the batteries go bad. Everything you ever saw in a submarine movie happens to the U-123 on the bottom. In fact, Hartigan thinks he's done for. He begins to plan to abandon ship, which is to pass out oxygen masks to all the crew. Then he would flood the boat, destroy the secret codes, and everybody would float to the surface. But in order to make that happen, he needs to make sure that the Dahlgren's not dropping depth charges on top of them, because the men will just be blown to bits in the water. So while he's waiting for his opportunity, they hear the Dahlgren moving off to the north. And the Germans celebrate. They think they've fooled the Americans with their oil slick and their air bubbles. The Dahlgren records kind of indicate that they weren't sure whether they saw a submarine at all. This is kind of how unprepared we were. Hartigan notes in his logbook that had it been a British destroyer, they would have stayed on top of us for 36 hours and we'd all be dead. Hartigan gets his boat onto the surface. They make repairs. They recharge the battery. They put down on the bottom again for the next day. The following night, they're off Cape Canaveral. You'll recall he has 1 torpedo left. He sinks 2 freighters off of Cape Canaveral that night. Men in the water. He takes the first with his torpedo, takes the second with the deck gun alone. As he's shelling the second ship, men in the water from the first sinking 4 miles away can hear the gunfire as they float in the Atlantic, hoping that someone will come out and rescue them. Devoid of torpedoes, he puts his boat into the Gulf Stream. He heads home to his submarine bases in France. Along the way, he drafts a poem to Admiral Dönitz celebrating his successes. He's sunk 10 ships so far on this trip. That goes with the 10 that he sank on the first trip, bringing his current total to 20. After sending the telegram, he encounters the SS Alcoa Guide out to sea. They have some deck gun shells left, so they decide to take her as well, bringing his total to 21. He goes home to Germany. He's lauded. He's met by marching bands. He meets Hitler, and he's given the oak leaves for his Iron Cross. The Gulf America, the bow, floats on the surface for 6 days before she finally slips under. She's still out there about 4 to 5 miles off the coast. For a long period, she was a dive destination and a fish haven. For a period of time, she was marked by a nun's buoy because she was considered a hazard to navigation. My understanding is she's kind of collapsed on herself, and she's mostly just a reef anymore. A variety of things wash ashore. Mattresses, pieces of ships, bananas we talked about, dead bodies. The last dead body washes ashore April 19th, 9 days later in St. Augustine. It's the body of a man named Michael James Monahan. He has no next of kin. He's buried in a pauper's grave in San Lorenzo Cemetery in St. Augustine. And like Rhodes, he gets his stone in 1945. He must have captured the public's imagination. I don't know the details, but they did build a Liberty ship out of Panama, named the Michael James Monahan, named after him. The final thing that washes ashore is oil. Lots and lots and lots of oil for decades. And if you were on Jacksonville Beach in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, you might walk down the beach and get oil on your feet. I was in New Jersey, and I was walking down the beach getting oil on my feet. My mother used to take it off with turpentine or paint thinner. All that oil, all that tar was oil, and if you're on Jack's Beach, it was oil from the Gulf of America. If you're up with me around Cape May, it was some other ship that some German submarine sank off the coast. But for decades, that oil continues to wash ashore. Met a woman the other day at one of my speeches who had borrowed her sister's white shark skin bathing suit. in the August of 1942 and had taken it swimming in Jacksonville Beach and had gotten tar on it. Apparently, I'm not sure which sister I was talking to, but apparently they had still not recovered from that event 75 years ago. The U-123 goes, Hartigan gets promoted, and part of what he gets out of this is he gets to live, because the submarine corps is not a high survival rate. He gets promoted, he never goes back to sea again. The U-123 does, under a different commander. She survives the war until June of 1944. After D-Day, the Germans have to give up their submarine bases in western France on the Atlantic coast of France. The Germans take the U-123 out to sea. They sink her, they scuttle her. After the war, the Americans go out, they raise the U-123 from the bottom. They give her to the French. The French rechristen her Le Blason. She remains an active member of the French Navy until 1959, which time she's scrapped, which is a total disaster. Wish we could find, I wish it was still there, we could put it out in the harbor here, and it would be a great tourist destination. It was probably the best submarine the French ever had. Certainly the most successful. Hartigan himself survives the war. He goes back to Germany. He writes a book. The book's entitled Auf Gefechtsstationen, which means to battle stations. It's ghostwritten, from my understanding. At least, somebody edited his thoughts. It's mostly about his exploits off the United States, where he sinks the 21 ships during the Second Happy Time. It's, for a period of time, the second best-selling book in Germany, behind Mein Kampf. It's illegal to this day to buy that book if you live in Germany. I bought a copy. They're rare. They're kind of expensive. I bought a copy from a guy in Germany. He can sell it to me, but he can't buy it himself. Hartigan goes on to make a fortune in the oil business. He works for a period of time with Texaco. He ultimately becomes a member of the Bundestag, the German parliament. And he's active in Bremen politics for decades. He's still alive today. He's 104 years old. He lives in Bremen, Germany. He's the last surviving German U-boat commander. He's been the last surviving German U-boat commander since 2002. Sometimes I wonder if the guy didn't make a pact with the devil. By the way, everybody who's ever met him says he's one of the greatest people you ever meet in your life, including some of the people he sunk. So, my day job, I think I indicated this or in the introduction, I manage investment portfolios. I'm a portfolio manager, I'm not a salesman. I manage investment portfolios for individuals, and I'm a big fan of the stock market. And had we met 75 years ago on April 10th, the date of this sinking, all the news would have been bad. The war news was bad. The stock market was plummeting. The Philippines had fallen that very same day. The Bataan Death March will begin the next day. All the news is bad. And had I at that time said to you, now might be a good time to buy stocks, you would have all laughed at me. But as it turns out, we're 8 days away from the bottom. On April 18th, 1942, the market bottoms. It begins its longest sustained rally in stock market history. And a big part of that is the war news starts to turn. We win the battle of Midway in June of 1942. But what really starts to turn the war is American industrial production. American corporations producing just tons of stuff. The Germans sink 244 ships off the East Coast in 7 months. We turn around and we build 2,700 Liberty ships. And my favorite number from that period, at the height of the war, at the Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan, they roll a B-24 bomber off the assembly line every 61 minutes. Just amazing, 61 minutes. Now, Jennifer, who follows me around and has heard this speech over 50 times, and if anything else, got to give her praise for that. She likes to point out at this point in my presentation that those B-24 bombers rolling off the assembly line every 61 minutes were built by women. Rosie the Riveter. So my conclusion to this speech is this. Never bet against the United States of America. Never, ever bet against the USA.